The cold morning light barely touched the runways of eastern England when the engines began to roar. One by one, the B-17 Flying Fortress bombers rolled forward, carrying young men who knew long before the wheels left the ground that the odds were not in their favor. They tightened the straps of their heavy flight suits. They tucked photographs from home into their pockets. And in the dim frost-filled cabin, silence settled with the weight of a final prayer. By 1943, the skies over Europe had become a place where thousands of American airmen vanished into black smoke and twisted aluminum. Entire formations of World War II bombers disappeared before they even reached their targets. A mission completed meant only one thing: another mission would follow. 25 were required for a man to go home. Most would never reach that number. The 8th Air Force calculated its losses. Commanders debated armor, firepower, escort fighters, anything that might keep more crews alive. But the answers they needed were buried beneath the noise of war, hidden in the bullet-riddled wings of the planes that limped back to base. And then came a quiet mathematician named Abraham Wald, who asked a single question that no one else dared to ask. A question that would save thousands of lives. By early 1943, the air war over Europe had hardened into something relentless. Every dawn, crews of the B-17 Flying Fortress climbed into their aircraft knowing that German fighters and flak batteries were waiting for them beyond the channel. The briefings were clinical targets, waypoints, altitudes, but the truth was always the same. The 8th Air Force would lose men before noon. And by dusk, more families back home would receive the telegram no parent wanted to see. The missions into Germany demanded precision and courage. Oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, rail yards, each was a piece of the Axis war machine. Hitting them required flying straight and level through storms of metal. The World War II bombers were strong, but the fire that greeted them was stronger still. German fighters slashed through formations in coordinated waves. Anti-aircraft bursts filled the sky with black shrapnel. Crews described it as flying through a thunderstorm made of steel. The cost-mounted October 1943 became a turning point, a week so brutal it earned its own name. Black Week began with heavy losses and ended at Schweinfurt, where dozens of bombers went down in a single afternoon. 60 B-17s were shot from the sky during the second raid alone, and hundreds of airmen never returned. For the 8th Air Force, it was more than a tactical defeat. It was a warning that their entire daylight bombing strategy was at risk of collapse. Commanders understood the problem in numbers so large they felt almost abstract. In practice, the danger was painfully real. A bomber crew's life expectancy hovered around 11 missions, yet they were required to fly 25 before they could go home. Each morning, they passed empty bunk spaces where someone had slept the night before. Each evening, someone else packed away a fallen airman's letters watch or lucky charm, promising to send them to a family that still believed their son was alive. Solving the crisis meant finding a way to protect the aircraft themselves. But armor was a paradox. Too much armor made the bombers heavy, slow, and unable to reach their targets. Too little, and they remained helpless against cannon shells and shrapnel. Engineers worked the problem endlessly. Where could the aircraft carry armor without sacrificing range? Which parts of the bomber were most vulnerable? Where did they need protection the most? At first, the answer seemed obvious. Crews returning from missions brought aircraft covered in bullet holes. Wings were punctured, tails were torn. Fuselage looked like metal sieves. Ground crews mapped every impact point on the B-17 Flying Fortress and its sister aircraft, believing these patterns showed where the bombers needed reinforcement. It felt practical. It felt logical. But this logic had a quiet flaw, one that no engineer had yet seen. Amid the crisis, a small team of mathematicians and statisticians at Columbia University was assigned to review the data. This group would later become famous for its wartime work. But at the time, it was simply known as the Statistical Research Group. Among its members was a man who had escaped Europe only months before Abraham Wald. He carried no weapon, commanded no planes, and yet in the shadow of Black Week, he was about to influence the fate of thousands. And the solution he would find would hinge on a single overlooked truth about the World War II bombers and the silence of those that never returned. The Statistical Research Group in New York was nothing like a battlefield, Yet the stakes inside its narrow offices were every bit as real as those faced by the crews of the B-17 Flying Fortress. Chalkboards ran from floor to ceiling. Stacks of coded reports arrived daily from air bases across England. The U.S. military had asked the group to answer a question that seemed at first almost routine. Where should armor be placed to keep World War II bombers alive? Ground crews in Europe had already done the first part of the job. Each time a damaged bomber rolled to a stop, teams swarmed it with clipboards measuring every hole made by cannon fire or shrapnel. They charted the damage point by point, turning battered aircraft into data maps. When these diagrams reached the 8th Air Force, the pattern appeared unmistakable. Wings, fuselage, and tail were riddled with impacts. Engines and cockpit areas were far less marked. The conclusion felt self-evident. Armor the places with the most bullet holes. Protect the areas with the heaviest damage. It seemed so obvious that no one questioned it, except one man. When Abraham Wald studied the diagrams, he did not see what the others saw. He noticed instead what was missing. The patterns were too clean, too consistent. The engines which enemy fighters aimed for showed surprisingly little damage. So did the cockpit, so did the fuel systems. Wald's mind followed a different thread. If fighters attacked all parts of the aircraft, why was the damage uneven? He asked a question that froze the room. Where are the planes with engine damage? Silence settled, not because the answer was complex, but because it was painfully simple. The diagrams only included the bombers that made it back to England. The aircraft that took fatal hits never returned. They crashed in German fields, burned over the channel, or disintegrated in mid-air. Their data, the truly critical data, was gone. The flaw was not in the mathematics. It was in the sample. Wald recognized a logic that few had articulated before. Studying only survivors creates a false picture of reality. The absence of damage on returning bombers did not mean engines were rarely hit. It meant that when engines were hit, the bombers never came home. This was the birth of what we now call survivorship bias, a quiet, devastating distortion that hides the very failures that matter most. Wald proposed an idea that overturned the military's initial instinct. The heavily damaged areas, the fuselage, the wings, the tail, were not the weak points. They were the places a bomber could endure hits and still fly. The vulnerable zones were the ones that showed the least damage in the data. The engines, the cockpit, and the fuel systems. These were the wounds that killed without leaving evidence on the aircraft that returned. It was a revelation as profound as any tactical breakthrough on the battlefield. By shifting the armor to the missing bullet holes, the U.S. military improved survivability dramatically. More crews lived to complete their missions. More bomber formations returned intact. And the 8th Air Force gained time, precious, irreplaceable time, to continue the air campaign that would help shape the outcome of the war. In the end, Wald had fought a battle of his own. A battle not against enemy aircraft, but against a dangerous assumption hidden within the data, and his victory would echo far beyond the steel frames of the World War II bombers he helped save. The success of Wald's analysis rippled quickly through the Allied command structure. Almost immediately, engineering teams began redesigning protective plates for the World War II bombers. Instead of reinforcing the already perforated fuselage and wings, they shifted the limited armor to the engine's cockpit and fuel systems, the places where a single hit meant certain death. Slowly, the numbers began to change. Bombers that once spiraled into black smoke now limped home on crippled wings. Crews who once vanished over Germany returned to their bunks, exhausted but alive. For the 8th Air Force, these incremental improvements mattered. Each bomber saved meant 10 more airmen who could fly again. Each formation that returned intact meant the strategic bombing campaign could continue without collapsing under its own losses. Wald's insight, born quietly in a room filled with chalk dust and paper charts, became one of the unseen pillars supporting the air war in Europe. But behind this analytical triumph lay a personal tragedy that few at the time understood. Before joining the statistical research group, Abraham Wald had escaped a continent descending into darkness. In 1938, after the Nazi annexation of Austria, Wald fled Vienna with little more than a suitcase in the promise of a temporary academic position in America. He hoped he could bring his family out later. He hoped, as millions did, that there was still time. There was not 8 of the 9 relatives he left behind, his parents, his siblings, the very people who had taught him to read, to question, to think, were murdered in Auschwitz. Wald carried that loss silently, as so many refugees of his generation did. He poured himself into his work, perhaps because solving problems was the only part of his life he could still control. And yet, even as he wrestled with grief, his methods shaped entire fields. After the war, he expanded his ideas into sequential analysis, a system that allowed researchers to reach conclusions faster with fewer lives or resources spent. In medicine, this meant identifying effective treatments sooner. In manufacturing, it meant safer products. In military science, it meant better decisions with imperfect information, a lesson written in the bullet holes of the B-17 Flying Fortress. But history is rarely kind to its quiet heroes. In 1950, Wald accepted an invitation to lecture in India, a routine academic visit. On December 13th, aboard a Douglas C-47 flying over the Nilgiri Mountains, the aircraft struck a ridge hidden by clouds. There were no survivors. The mathematician who had saved thousands of airmen by seeing the invisible vulnerabilities of aircraft became the victim of a fatal aviation accident himself. Columbia University mourned. The global statistics community fell silent. And yet, Wald's work did not end with his passing. His memoranda on the damage patterns of World War II bombers, once locked away under military classification, continued shaping military analysis for decades. His identification of survivorship bias became a cornerstone of modern critical thinking. The man who had taught the world to look for the missing planes left behind a legacy of clarity in a world often clouded by assumptions. In the aftermath of Black Week, American commanders faced a truth no military institution welcomes: courage alone could not offset soaring casualties. The daylight bombing campaign, the backbone of Allied strategy, was becoming unsustainable. The 8th Air Force needed more than new aircraft or heavier firepower. It needed a new way of thinking. What Abraham Wald provided was not just a mathematical correction. It was a cultural shift in how the United States approached strategy, risk, and evidence. His analysis demonstrated that even the most formidable machines of war, the World War II bombers that carried tens of thousands of Americans into enemy airspace, were vulnerable in ways that field reports had masked. The B-17 Flying Fortress had earned its reputation for ruggedness, but ruggedness alone was not enough. By teaching the military to scrutinize the invisible gaps in their data, Wald helped the U.S. adopt a mindset that valued reflective skepticism over instinct. It was an approach that strengthened the American war machine without adding a single gun or engine. This shift extended far beyond wartime operations. Across, the Allied command officers began to ask new questions. What aren't we seeing? Which failures are hidden from us? What assumptions are we mistaking for facts? Long after the war, these questions became central to military education. At war colleges, cadets studied the armor diagrams of returning bombers, not just as engineering puzzles, but as metaphors for strategic blindness. In an era defined by radar, long-range missiles, and nuclear planning, the lesson remained the same: survival can deceive you. And the lessons buried in loss are often the ones that matter most. Globally, the impact was just as profound. As nations rebuilt fields as different as economics, medicine, finance, and public policy adopted Wald's logic, survivorship bias became a universal warning, reminding scientists not to trust only the patients who reached the hospital, reminding investors not to trust only the funds that stayed in business, reminding leaders not to trust only the strategies that appeared to succeed. For American audiences today, especially those who remember the Cold War or who served in later conflicts, Wald's insight carries a familiar resonance. It is the idea that power demands humility, and that the clearest truths often come from questioning what everyone else accepts without thought. In a world shaped by complex data and shifting threats, the discipline to see what is missing remains as vital as ever. When we look back at the war today, the images that endure are dramatic ones. Squadrons of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers crossing the channel, the black blossoms of flak rising to meet them, the desperate arcs of crippled aircraft falling toward the earth. But the quieter images matter just as much. A chalkboard in a narrow room at Columbia, A set of diagrams covered in dots. A single question posed by a man who had lost nearly everything, yet still believed that clear thinking could save lives. That man was Abraham Wald, and his legacy stretches far beyond the wings of the World War II bombers he helped protect. He taught us that the truth is not always found in what we can see. Often it lives in the spaces we overlook, the empty bunks, the silent aircraft that never returned, the gaps in our data that hide the real cost of survival. His understanding of survivorship bias did more than correct a military mistake. It offered a framework for humility in a world that often celebrates only its victories. For the 8th Air Force, Wald's insight meant something deeply human. It meant more crews making it home, more letters delivered instead of telegrams, more sons returning to families who had prayed through every mission. His work preserved not just aircraft, but futures, weddings, careers, lives that would have otherwise ended over foreign fields. And yet, the lesson he left us extends far beyond 1943. In our own lives, we often judge success by the examples that stand in front of us. Thriving businesses, remarkable recoveries, daring achievements. But Wald reminds us to ask the harder question, what stories are missing? What losses are invisible? What failures have vanished from the record, leaving behind only the illusion of certainty? It is a question worth asking not just in war, but in every decision that shapes our world. So as the echoes of those wartime engines fade into history, we are left with a final image, the planes that never made it home, and the mathematician who taught us to learn from their absence. His insight still guides us quiet, steady, essential. Before you go, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you believe is the most important lesson from Abraham Wald's story? And if you value the way history reveals these hidden truths, consider subscribing. Together, we can continue exploring the decisions and the unseen consequences that have shaped our world.